Welcome to Daily News Simplified from Raus IAS Study Circle. Today, let us take up some of the important news which has appeared in the new Delhi edition of 19 July 2023. Let's start our discussion with this article on page number 8 in the editorial section. And this article goes into the historical understanding of close relationship between India and France. And this article has been written by Suhasini Haider. So this article says that India, France, and what keeps their ties ticking. The formula is geopolitics without value judgments and no pressure to align their respective position. So clearly we understand that India and France are two different countries. They are located in two separate geographies of the world. And these countries are also different in terms of their geopolitical influence or the influence which they have on the geopolitical world. So this topic with respect to bilateral relation between India and France gets covered under GS paper 2 with respect to international relations. Now when we talk about France, France is very different from India, of course, as France is one of the permanent member of United Nations Security Council. France is a member of NSG and is also a member of NATO. India, on the other hand, is aspiring to become a permanent member of United Nations Security Council, and in this regard, France has always supported India's permanent membership. Further, France also did the heavy lifting or played a major role with respect to NSG waiver, which was granted to India way back in 2008, and this allowed India to have civil nuclear agreement with France, with America, and also with other countries. Now this article suggests that this historical relation between India and France rests on three important pillars. These three important pillars are non-interference in internal affairs of each other's country. As we have seen that the day Prime Minister Narendra Modi landed in France, the European Union Parliament criticized India's approach in Manipur. Despite this criticism by the European Union Parliament, France considered it an internal matter of India. Similarly, the riot which took place in France because of killing of the boy was not mentioned by India. So both India and France maintain non-interference or ensure non-interference in their internal matters. And this has been one of the highlighting features of the strong relationship between India and France. The next pillar highlighted by the author is belief in strategic autonomy by both France and India. Now here we need to understand this term strategic autonomy, as this term has often been mentioned by India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. So strategic autonomy denotes ability of a state to pursue its national interest and adopt its preferred foreign policy without being constrained in any manner by other states. So suppose India wants to pursue a particular kind of foreign policy on Jammu and Kashmir. Now there is a possibility that other countries such as say United States of America, Russia, China or even Pakistan may influence or force India to change its policy with respect to Jammu and Kashmir. Now, India will not change its policy regarding Jammu and Kashmir or any of its policy, either internal or external, based on pressures by foreign entities or by foreign countries. So it says that strategic autonomy denotes ability of a state to pursue its national interest and adopt its preferred foreign policy without being constrained in any manner by the other states. Another example of strategic autonomy can be said to be that United States of America want India's presence in the South China Sea or in the Indo-Pacific region. However, India has been reluctant on a direct engagement with China by its presence in the region. So this is another example of strategic autonomy as deployed by India or any other state for that matter of fact. So it says that strategic autonomy or this principle helps any state, that is any country, to resist pressure exerted by more powerful and influential countries, which may compel the state to change its policy. So it's almost like external sovereignty, that despite pressure from a more powerful country, a particular country will not change its stance or change its policy, either national or foreign, in order to serve the interest of the powerful country. And this aspect of strategic autonomy between India and France has also been one of the basic pillars or an important pillars in their historical ties. Now, this belief in strategic autonomy was highlighted by the President of France, Charles de Gaulle, who was French president from 1959 to 1969. And the third pillar with respect to Indo-French ties is that of non-alignment, as highlighted by India's first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And this principle of non-alignment has allowed both countries, that is India and France, to refrain from pulling or pushing the other country into any alliance. For example, France is a part of NATO, but India has always shown its reluctance to join NATO. And in the words of India's External Affairs Minister, he has stated that NATO is not for a template that applies to India. So clearly, both countries do not pull or push each other to join any multilateral alliance. Now, another president of France, Jacques Chirac, has stated that attraction for France with respect to India is regarding India's history, the democratic choices which has been made by India, India's attachment to secularism, coexistence of diverse culture, people, language and ethnicity in the country, and all of these has helped to create a more balanced world order. So all of these together have ensured better relations between India and France as compared to any other European country or even that with United States of America. Now Puneet sir has already discussed in the DNS dated 14 July about India's France special relationship with respect to space technology, nuclear technology, defense sector and other aspects of growing ties between India and France. So this article in a way highlights the historical ties between India and France, as France not only helped India in having the NSG waiver way back in 2008, but France was the first country with which India signed its first nuclear deal. Now this special relationship has also had certain awkward moments in the past, as this article highlights that in 1976, that is post-emergency, that is after Indira Gandhi imposed emergency in India, the then Prime Minister of France, Jacques Chirac, visited India in 1976 after France had hosted Paris Conference on International Economic Cooperation, which focused on global energy crisis on developing countries after the US-Arab tension over the Yom Kippur War, that is the Fourth Arab-Israeli War. Now after Indira Gandhi imposed emergency in 1975, major powers of the world criticized this step as it put restrictions on freedom of speech and other aspects. And despite this growing criticism, the French Prime Minister visited India in such a scenario. So all these historical developments have helped to strengthen the ties between India and France. Another awkward moment was in 1998 when India conducted the nuclear test. Now France, although condemned the nuclear test along with the P5 members, that is permanent members of the Security Council, but refrained from imposing any sanctions or did not impose any sanctions, unlike the United States or United Kingdom. Now this article overall highlights that there are three pillars with respect to growing India-France ties, and we have already discussed, that is non-interference in internal affairs, belief in strategic autonomy and non-alignment, that is refraining each other from pulling or pushing into other alliances. So let's take some examples with respect to these three pillars as to what has sustained India-France ties over the past few years. So some of the examples of non-interference and non-alliances include India's positioning on Ukraine war with Russia, which is very different from that of the Western world, including France and United States of America, because of India's close ties with Russia. Now, India also abstained on a UNSC resolution, that is, resolution introduced by the United Nations Security Council, initiated by France on humanitarian aid, which was to be provided in the conflict zone. However, India did not support this particular resolution, but there was no response from the French government. So both these countries ensure a strategic autonomy and do not have any problem with respect to their respective decision making in the international arena. Another example highlighted here is with respect to India's indifference to French President China's visit in April and the statement by French President on its China policy, as the French President highlighted that Europe cannot be a vassal state to United States on its China policy. Now we all know that through Quad, India and United States are very close and coordinating with respect to their steps on their policy in the Indo-Pacific region in order to counter China. Now the term vassal state has often been mentioned by French president, and a vassal state means a subordinate state or a state which has certain obligation towards a superior state. So in this sense, the French president highlighted that United States is not a superior state whereby the European countries are obligated to take steps according to the national interest of United States of America. Now this article also highlights about some of the examples of non-alignment by steps taken by India and France. So it says that France publicly disapproved expansion of NATO, as the idea of NATO Plus intended to include other countries such as Japan, Australia, and also India. But India had no problem with this, as India has already rejected the plan of NATO Plus, and India's External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has said that NATO is not a template that applies to India. Now another example is India-France roadmap on Indo-Pacific. And according to this roadmap, neither side, that is neither India nor France, is pulling each other into any regional or military coalition. And France is also cool with Quad Plus proposal, according to which the idea is to include New Zealand, Vietnam, and South Korea or other Southeast Asian countries. But this is just a proposal and no concrete step has been taken so far. So overall, this article suggests that despite the compelling international politics, both India and France have ensured greater ties or better ties based on the three pillars, namely non-interference in internal affairs, belief in strategic autonomy, and non-alignment. And this topic gets covered under GS paper 2, particularly with respect to bilateral, regional and global groupings and agreements involving India or affecting India's interest. Now let's take up the next news, also appearing on page number 8 in the editorial section. And this news is with respect to GM mustard. Now we know that last year in October 2022, the government provided the environmental clearance or environmental release for GM mustard. The government here means the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee under Union Environment Ministry had recommended environmental release of genetically modified mustard. And this approval by the government paves the way for its commercial cultivation, which means commercial cultivation of GM mustard. Now, one of the reasons provided by the government for providing environmental clearance and other regulatory clearance to GM mustard was that India met 70% of its domestic cooking oil demand by importing variety of oils including palm oil, soybean oil, and also sunflower oil. So according to the government, this approval will meet the growing demand of edible oil in the country through commercial cultivation of GM mustard. However, there have been certain concerns based on which cases have been filed in the Supreme Court. And these concerns which is being debated is with respect to the safety aspects of using or eating GM mustard, the efficacy of the process, and also the necessity as to what is the need for having GM mustard. Because there are certain agricultural scientists who have highlighted that availability of non-GM mustard hybrids have better yield than GM mustard. So it is in these backdrop, a PIL has been filed in the Supreme Court with respect to the safety aspect, health aspect, efficacy aspect, and also the need or necessity for giving approval for GM mustard, as according to certain agricultural scientists, there are certain non-GM mustard varieties which have better yield as compared to GM mustard. So it is in this backdrop, this article highlights that the government has disregarded certain aspects of science and also law while giving approval to the GM mustard variety. So in October 2022, the Environment Ministry allowed environmental release of Dhara mustard hybrid or DMH11, which is a transgenic mustard developed by Delhi University for its seed production and testing before its commercial release. Now DMH11 is a herbicide tolerant mustard or HT mustard variety that has undergone genetic modification. And this genetic modification has two alien genes, namely Barnase and Barstar. and this has been isolated from a soil bacteria called Bacillus. Now, the author in this article has highlighted certain concerns as the government is not providing correct data with respect to the scientific facts regarding GM mustard. So, here the author overall has suggested that rather than engaging with the constitutional issues involving public health, because GM mustard will be consumed by the people as edible oil, environmental protection and agricultural livelihoods, the government is disregarding the facts and logic before the Supreme Court. So case has been filed before the Supreme Court, and it highlights that a coalition of GM Free India, which is an informal network of organizations and individuals, which is an institution which campaigns or advocates to keep India GM free. And this institution, that is the coalition of GM Free India, has opposed the move of the center, claiming it to be unscientific, and has also alleged that no biosafety protocols were followed in the process to provide environmental clearance to GM mustard. So this is one of the allegations which has been put across by the coalition of GM Free India. Now, other than this particular case, there is another case which is pending in the Supreme Court since 2004 with respect to GMO, that is genetically modified organisms. So in this particular case, whereby the government or GEAC had provided environmental clearance to GM mustard, the court asked that is there a compelling reason for the environmental release of genetically modified herbicide tolerant mustard or HT mustard crop at this stage, and will such release of such HT mustard crop have an irreversible adverse effect on the environment? So these are some of the pressing matters which are pending in the Supreme Court. So this article overall concludes by saying that ultimately the decision of the Supreme Court will either pave the way for commercial cultivation of not only GM mustard but other GM crops as well, or other GM edible foods as well, or it will halt the process. Now, some of the concerns with respect to regulatory approval and also the scientific process with respect to GM foods were also looked into by various parliamentary committees, such as Parliamentary Committee on Science and Technology and Environment, and also by Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture. Now, the Supreme Court also appointed technical expert committee to look into various aspects of GM crop. Now, various issues or concerns have also been highlighted by parliamentary committees constituted by the central government in 2012 and 2017. Now, the Parliamentary Committee on Agriculture was constituted in 2012, and that of Science and Technology and Environment was constituted in 2017. So, it highlighted the concerns regarding weakness in the regulatory system and also called for caution in the release of GM crop. Further, there were other concerns which were also raised, such as flouting of laws at various steps regarding giving approval of GM crop. Another serious concern highlighted with respect to GM mustard was that there was a flawed understanding on effects of GM mustard on honeybees and also other pollinators. And this flawed understanding also led to the approval by GEAC. Another concern is bypassing biosafety protocols. Further allegations were also made by coalition of GM Free India, which advocate GM free food in India, as according to them, there were no trials conducted with respect to GM mustard, and GMO was changed after the approval of the test, making the whole process flawed. Other than this, the Committee on Science and Technology, Environment and Forest made a specific reference to GM mustard and asked the government to conduct a thorough, independent and transparent assessment of long-term effect or long-term impact of GM mustard on biosafety aspects, environmental risk which it poses, and various socio-economic impacts posed by GM mustard. Because the commercial cultivation of GM mustard will ultimately lead to people consuming these edible oil. Now, even the Supreme Court appointed technical expert committee, 5 of its 6 members highlighted or pointed out that there were grave deficiencies in the safety assessment of GM crops according to their 2013 report. And they also highlighted that herbicide tolerant crops or HT crops were completely unsuitable to Indian context, and they also warned of serious harm with respect to their impact on environment, impact on rural livelihood, and also impact on sustainable agriculture. So these were also some of the concerns which were highlighted by members of technical expert committee, which was appointed by the Supreme Court based on a public interest litigation filed. So based on these concerns, the question is as to what needs to be done. And here the author highlights that there is a need to acknowledge various shortcomings with respect to the regulatory aspect and also the scientific process which is followed in order to achieve those governmental approvals. So there is a need to acknowledge various shortcomings not only in terms of process but also with respect to the impact of final outcome. And this has also been suggested not only by members of technical expert committee appointed by Supreme Court, as it highlighted that impact of herbicide tolerant crop should be looked into with respect to Indian context regarding environment, rural livelihood, and also sustainable agriculture. And also the Committee on Science and Technology also raised concerns and asked government to conduct a thorough, independent and transparent assessment of long-term effect with respect to biosafety, environmental risk and socio-economic impacts of using GM crops. Further, the author highlights two important aspects whereby, according to the author, the government is rushing into regarding governmental approval on GM mustard. So here the author says that the GM mustard should not be pushed in utter disregard either to the scientific aspects or to the legal aspects. Now with respect to the scientific aspect as proposed by the government in the Supreme Court, it highlighted that GM mustard should not be considered as herbicide tolerant at all, as the objective is to improve yields. Now this is not true because GM mustard is a herbicide tolerant crop. And according to the technical expert committee, this is not suitable or unsuitable to Indian context. Now with respect to the legal lacuna, the author says that government has not placed biosafety rules on GM mustard in the public domain, and this has impacted citizens' right to know under the RTI Act of 2005. So clearly the concerns on GM mustard should be addressed. Now coming to the regulatory aspect, the Government of India under the Environment Protection Act of 1986 has come up with rules for the manufacture, use, import, export and storage of hazardous microorganisms, genetically engineered organisms or cells. And these rules, also referred as the 1989 rules, are very broad in scope, essentially covers entire spectrum of activities involving the genetically modified organism and products thereof, including sale, storage, exportation, importation, production, manufacturing, packaging, etc. And these rules cover areas of research as well as large-scale applications of GMOs and its products, and they also apply to these aspects, namely manufacture, import and storage of microorganisms and gene technological products, genetically engineered organisms or microorganisms and cells, and correspondingly to any substances and products and foodstuffs, etc., of which such cells, organisms or tissues hereof form part, and new gene technologies in addition to cell hybridization and genetic engineering. So with respect to the regulation of genetically modified organisms and products thereof in India, includes all types of organisms, microorganisms, plants, animals, insects, etc. All activities involving research, import, export, field trials, manufacture, storage, etc. The regulations also include approval requirements for stages of research, safety assessment, and field trials and environmental release and monitoring, and all organizations, both public and private sector, are involved. And if we talk about the competent authorities, then it highlights that the 1989 rules are implemented by the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, the Department of Biotechnology, Ministry of Science and Technology, and state governments. And 6 competent authorities and their composition and roles have been notified under these rules. These competent authorities includes the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, which has an advisory role, Institutional Biosafety Committees, Review Committee on Genetic Manipulation and Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. Now these committees are not mere advisory but provide approval to such GMOs. Then there are State Biotechnology Coordination Committees and District Level Committee. These are monitoring institutions or monitoring authorities. So these are some of the competent authorities under the 1989 GMO rules. Thus, this article gets covered under GS paper 3, particularly with respect to science and technology developments and their application and effects in everyday life, and also achievements of Indians in science and technology, indigenization of technology, especially with respect to GM mustard, and also developing new technology in India. Now let's look into these two questions asked by UPSC in the prelims of 2021 and 2015. The question asked in 2015 was, the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee is constituted under the options were A. Food Safety and Standards Act 2006, B. Geographical Indications of Goods Registration and Protection Act 1999, C. Environment Protection Act 1986, and D. Wildlife Protection Act 1972. The question asked in 2021 was, Bollgard 1 and Bollgard 2 technologies are mentioned in the context of, options were A. Clonal propagation of crop plants, B. Developing genetically modified crop plants, C. Production of plant growth substances, and D. Production of biofertilizers. Now in this question asked in 2021, the correct answer was B, that is developing genetically modified crop plants, and both Bollgard 1 and Bollgard 2 is associated with respect to BT cotton. Now with respect to this particular question on Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee or GEAC, what you can do is provide the answer in the comment section. Thus, this news becomes important both from prelims and also mains perspective under GS paper 3. With this, let's take up the next news for discussion. The next news for discussion appears on page number 14. And this news highlights about India's impressive record of 93% DP3 immunization coverage in 2022, according to the World Health Organization. So this news highlights that recently the World Health Organization and UNICEF have released estimates for national immunization coverage for 2022 for 195 member states, including India. Now, each year, WHO and UNICEF jointly review reports submitted by member states to both agencies regarding national immunization coverage. And in this regard, India has achieved an all-time high coverage of national immunization coverage with respect to the DPT vaccine. Now, DPT vaccine here stands for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, and 3 stands for the third dose. So, the problem of diphtheria can lead to difficulty in breathing, heart failure, paralysis, or even death. Tetanus causes painful stiffening of the muscles. Tetanus can also lead to serious health problems, including being unable to open the mouth, having trouble swallowing and breathing, and it can even cause death. Whereas pertussis, also known as whooping cough, can cause uncontrollable violent coughing, which makes it very difficult to breathe, eat, or drink. Now, pertussis can be extremely serious, especially in babies and young children, causing pneumonia, convulsions, brain damage, or even death. So, we see in all these 3 diseases, which generally attacks children, it can lead to death, and that's why immunization for DPT is very important. Regarding pertussis, it further says that in teens and adults, it can cause weight loss, loss of bladder control, passing out, and also rib fractures from severe coughing. So these are serious ailments or serious diseases which should be tackled at a very young age. And it is in this regard, WHO and UNICEF provide a sort of an estimate as to how the immunization program in different countries are taking place. And if you look at this graph, then you can see that the graph of India has increased post 2000, and after a dip, especially during COVID, it has again achieved a high of 93%. So it says that India recorded 93% coverage for the third dose of diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus vaccine in 2022, surpassing the pre-pandemic all-time high of 91%. So the dip which was seen during the pandemic has been surpassed, and India's immunization coverage, especially with respect to DPT, has been an impressive 93%. So the coverage of DPT vaccines, which rose to 93% in 2022, has surpassed the previous pre-pandemic best of 91%, which was recorded in 2019, and has also marked a sharp increase from the 85% recorded in 2021 because of the impact of COVID pandemic. Now, according to WHO and CDC, that is Center for Disease Control of United States of America, it is recommended that children receives 5 doses of DTP, usually at the following ages, namely at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, between 15 to 18 months, and from 4 to 6 years. Now, the news further highlights that the Southeast Asian region had the best immunization recoveries among WHO regions, which can be majorly attributed to the efforts being made by India and also Indonesia. However, there are certain concerns which has been highlighted, as despite achieving 93% coverage of the DPT vaccines, in 2022, India still accounts for 1.6 million unvaccinated or under-vaccinated children for DPT-3. Now, under-vaccinated children means that such children who has received either 1 or 2 doses of DPT vaccine, and unvaccinated means those children who have not received any dosage of the DPT vaccine. So it says that the inequities in immunization coverage can lead to accumulation of pockets of unvaccinated children. So these pockets of unvaccinated children poses significant risk of outbreak of various diseases such as measles, diphtheria, and other vaccine preventable disease. So it's possible that these pockets of such children who are unvaccinated, these children can have certain disease, and these disease can further spread in other region. So it's important to ensure 100% immunization with respect to the third dose or the complete dose of DPT. Now, with respect to vaccination, the program in India or the scheme in India is Mission Indradhanush. This is India's universal immunization program, and it is the largest such program in the world, with annual cohorts of around 26.5 million infants and 29 million pregnant women. The mission initially aimed to immunize unvaccinated and partially vaccinated children of the country against 7 vaccine preventable diseases. However, as of now, under the universal immunization program, as of now, immunization is provided free of cost against 12 vaccine preventable diseases, nationally against 11 diseases, and subnationally against 1 disease. And these 11 diseases are diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, polio, measles, rubella, severe form of childhood tuberculosis, rotavirus diarrhea, hepatitis B, meningitis, and pneumonia caused by Haemophilus influenza type B and pneumococcal pneumonia, and subnationally against 1 disease, namely the Japanese encephalitis or JE vaccine, provided only in endemic districts in India. Thus, this news becomes important both from your prelims and mains perspective and gets covered especially under GS paper 2 under social issues relating to health. With this, we come to an end to today's discussion. Thank you for watching DNS.